if you trace the origins of like almost every terrifying, world-breaking villain in history and even in mythology, honestly, you're rarely going to find a monster just standing right there at the starting line.
Right, exactly.
Like if you look closely enough, you almost always find a victim, someone who was hurt, someone who was betrayed, or, someone who suffered a very real, very legitimate wound.
Yeah, which is hard for us to process because we are completely wired to look at the world through this incredibly simple binary lens of good versus evil.
Oh, 100%. We look out at the landscape, whether it's like a movie we're watching or just the political climate we're living in, and we just want to quickly identify who's wearing the white hat and who's wearing the black hat.
It's just easier that way, right? It saves mental energy.
It totally does.
Yeah.
But what if we've been looking at this entirely the wrong way? I mean, what if that epic, world-ending battle between light and dark isn't actually happening out there in the physical world at all? What if it's happening entirely, like 100% inside of you?
Wow, yeah. And that is the exact paradigm shift we're unpacking today. It completely upends how we consume stories, how we judge others, and most importantly, how we view the trajectory of our own lives.
Because when you start looking at heroes and villains as like these two distinct species of people and start looking at them as psychological outcomes, everything changes.
It really does. Which brings us to the stack of notes we're diving into for this deep dive.
Yes. We have this really profound document provided for today, and it's just titled The Hero and Villain Dynamic.pdf.
Such a simple title for something so heavy.
Right. Like, when I first started reviewing this material, I just assumed it was going to be a literary analysis. Maybe, a guide on how to write better character arcs or analyze ancient myths.
Same here.
But it is so much more penetrating than that. It essentially takes this classic age-old struggle and redefines it completely through the lens of trauma, the concept of the shadow, and how human beings handle power when they're in pain.
And to give us a really sturdy framework for today's deep dive, we are going to explore all of this through a very specific psychological concept, which is individuation.
Individuation,
Right.
Let's break that down for people who might not know it.
Yeah, so if you aren't familiar with that term, individuation is essentially the lifelong psychological journey of becoming a whole, integrated, mature self.
Like putting the pieces of a puzzle together.
Exactly. Think of it as the process where you take all your different fragmented parts, so your light, your dark, your traumas, your conscious choices, and even your hidden, ugly impulses, and you bring them into a single, cohesive identity.
Okay, so through that lens of individuation, we're not looking at the hero and the villain as two different people who are just, like, born with different souls.
No, not at all. We're looking at them as two divergent paths that any single one of us can take when life inevitably hurts us.
Man, so let's start right there at the beginning, at that exact moment of being hurt. Because to really understand the end of the journey, the fully realized hero or the fully consumed villain, we have to look at the starting line.
We do. And the most shocking takeaway from the source here is that the starting line looks exactly the same for both of them.
Yes, they both start with a shared wound.
Precisely. The fundamental dynamic we're dealing with is about self-image, opposition, and power. Crucially, at the very beginning of the journey, both figures are usually wounded.
Both of them have suffered.
Yeah, both of them. And both of them may see a very real, legitimate problem in the world. Like they aren't hallucinating their grievance.
Right, which totally shatters what we might call the weak story.
The weak story.
Yeah, like the one we teach toddlers, right?
Right.
Hero good, villain bad. It's binary, it's clean, it's safe.
Oh, absolutely. But it's not real life.
No. A much stronger, more accurate psychological story acknowledges that both characters are carrying the exact same fire of injustice. Individuation has to begin with raw, unrefined material. Like a hero does not begin morally pure.
Right.
In fact, if you look at the starting point, a potential hero is often incomplete. They might be terrified, highly reactive, totally naive, extremely proud, or just, completely untested. They're a mess.
They're a total mess. And on the flip side of that mirror, the villain also does not begin as some cartoonish embodiment of evil.
Right. They don't just wake up wanting to destroy the world for fun.
Exactly. The most compelling villains, the ones that really resonate with us, the ones that terrify us because they feel so intensely real, they often begin with a deeply legitimate grievance.
Yeah.
They look at the world and they see real corruption. They experience deep hypocrisy, total abandonment, maybe severe systemic injustice, or just profound betrayal. They have been wronged.
It's been victimized.
Yes. Their initial trauma places them at the exact same crossroads in the individuation process as the hero. They are standing on the exact same plot of ground.
Okay, so they're standing at the same crossroads, they're looking at the same unjust world, and they're carrying their own respective wounds. The divergence lies entirely in how they respond to that wound.
Exactly.
And the source material has this simple, beautiful distillation of this pivot point. It says the hero looks at the wound and says, something is wrong and I must respond.
Right.
But the villain looks at the exact same wound and says, something is wrong and I am justified in taking control.
That is the definitive pivot point right there. It is all about the locus of control and how the human brain metabolizes trauma.
Metabolizes trauma. I like that.
Yeah, so the hero's psychological arc is about allowing themselves to be shaped by the trauma without becoming ruled by it.
Wow. Okay.
But the villain's arc, however, is about letting the trauma become the ultimate law.
The law.
Yes, the villain's brain decides that because they were hurt, because they were victimized, their trauma now entitles them to dominate, to punish, to consume, or to reshape others without their consent, purely to ensure they are never hurt again.
You know, I've been trying to wrap my head around why that specific shift happens. That shift from wanting a response to demanding absolute control. And I kept thinking about how the human immune system works.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, the immune system's entire job is to protect us from harm.
Right.
Right. But think about what an allergy actually is, or worse, like an autoimmune disease.
Okay. Yeah.
An autoimmune disease is essentially the body's trauma response overreacting. It misinterprets a relatively harmless substance or even its own healthy cells as a deadly existential threat.
Right. It gets confused.
Exactly. So in its absolute desperation to protect you, the immune system goes rogue. It attacks itself. It inflames the entire body. It tries to take absolute authoritarian control over the biological environment to prevent any perceived harm.
Wow, that is exactly like the villain's path.
Right. The villain is basically the psychological equivalent of an autoimmune response.
Yeah.
They have been legitimately threatened in the past, but their response is to trigger a cytokine storm of control over everyone around them so they never have to feel that vulnerability again.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it maps perfectly onto the psychology here.
Yep.
Because what happens with a severe autoimmune response? The defense mechanism itself becomes the disease.
Right.
The inflammation causes exponentially more damage than the original threat ever could have, and that is exactly what we see with the villain.
Their fall into darkness doesn't happen when they get hurt.
No, their fall happens when they decide that their pain gives them the right to bypass everyone else's sovereignty. The defense mechanism, the need for control, becomes the disease that destroys their life and the lives of those around them.
But if we look at real life, I mean, isn't there an incredibly blurry line between seeking justice and taking control?
Oh,
Like, let's say someone uncovers massive systemic corruption, or they've been deeply betrayed by an institution that was supposed to protect them. They have a legitimate grievance.
absolutely.
How does someone, whether it's a character in a movie or just you and me navigating our daily lives, how do we know when we've crossed that invisible line from hero into villain? When does seeking justice morph into that rogue autoimmune response?
It is a vital question, and it represents the core psychological test of individuation. The distinction lies in the concept of humility and limit.
Limits, okay?
Yeah, justice, by its very nature, recognizes limits. Justice recognizes the sovereignty and the rights of others. When a hero seeks justice, they're trying to restore a balance that serves everyone, or at least serves a higher objective principle of fairness. They're willing to submit to a system of accountability.
Right, they aren't trying to become the entire system.
Exactly. But when someone crosses into taking control of the villain's path, they are no longer interested in balance. They are interested in immunity.
Right.
They want to be completely immune from ever being hurt again, and the only way the human brain can guarantee absolute immunity is by possessing absolute power over its environment and the people in it.
So they stop choosing limits.
They reject responsibility entirely. They start choosing domination. The villain is simply the hero without humility.
You know, I think we really need to ground this in everyday experience, because it's so easy to detach from this when we use words like domination and sovereignty.
Fair point.
Like, think about a time when you were deeply wronged. Maybe you were passed over for a promotion at work in a way that was genuinely, objectively unfair. Or maybe you experienced a really painful betrayal in a long-term relationship.
We've all been there.
Right. What happens in your brain in that exact moment of acute pain? The absolute base instinct is to demand control.
Yeah.
We want to control the narrative. we immediately start thinking of ways to punish the person who hurt us. Like, we want to hoard information at work. We want to sabotage the person who got the promotion. We want to build a psychological wall so high and so thick that no one can ever get close enough to hurt us again.
And it feels good to think that way.
Feels intoxicating. But acknowledging that this exact instinct, that petty, vengeful desire to dominate the situation just to feel safe, is the very seed of the villain path.
Oh,
That is terrifying.
it is.
But recognizing it is the first real step of self-awareness.
It's terrifying because the hero and the villain are mirrors. On a foundational psychological level, regarding that initial wound and that raw instinct for self-protection, you and the tyrant are exactly the same.
Wow.
The individuation process, however, demands that we do more than just obey our reflexes. We have to choose a different path when that reflex fires.
And if we don't, like if we lean into that reflex and cross that line into control, well, the psychology shows that the trauma doesn't just stay a static wound.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't just naturally heal over time, which is kind of a comforting lie we tell ourselves. Once you cross into demanding dominion, the wound mutates. It turns into something much more dangerous, something defined in the text as the unintegrated shadow.
Which brings us to the psychology of the villain, or what we can call the shadow enthroned.
Okay,
Right. And because we want to be loved and accepted, we take those unacceptable parts and we stuff them into this invisible bag. We hide them. That is the shadow. It contains all the parts of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge or integrate into our conscious identity.
so an unintegrated shadow is when that bag is dragging behind you, completely full, but you're walking around pretending you don't even own a bag.
Exactly. You pretend you are only made of light and goodness. But the problem is, those hidden traits don't disappear just because you ignore them. They fester.
They rot in the bag.
Yes. And when a person refuses to do the internal work of opening that bag and integrating those darker parts when they experience trauma and refuse to process the grief and anger, they project all of that pain and fear outward onto the world.
So it's like they're hitting other people with a bag.
Pretty much. When you talk about the villain representing the unintegrated shadow, we are talking about a person who has taken all that denied pain, all that hidden rage, and instead of healing it, they have built their entire identity around it.
And the descriptors used for this state in the source are incredibly evocative. It's described as power without heart, sovereignty without service, intelligence without wisdom, desire without reverence, discipline without mercy, and vision without consent.
Vision without consent is perhaps the most dangerous of all of those.
That one really stuck with me too, because it sounds so noble at first, doesn't it? Like, I have a vision for the world. I have a vision for my company. I have a vision for my family.
Right, it sounds visionary.
But if you force that vision onto people without their consent, you aren't a visionary. You're a tyrant. And this ties perfectly into how a villain's identity functions. A villain is someone who makes victimhood their identity and their authority.
And there's a big difference between being a victim and being a villain.
Right. A victim is simply someone who has been harmed. That's a state of being. But a villain is someone who takes that state and says, consciously or unconsciously, because I was harmed, I am now permanently exempt from accountability.
And that is the ultimate catastrophic failure of individuation. Instead of taking the pain and integrating it into a mature self that understands the complexities and nuances of the world, they use the pain as an eternal get-out-of-jail-free card.
Wow.
In mythological language, this archetype is referred to as the false king, the tyrant ego, or the devouring mother. They claim absolute authority without any surrender.
They want the crown.
They want the crown, but they refuse to develop the heart required to wear it. They want the glory of leadership without the purification of empathy. It is a complete and total bypass of necessary psychological growth.
Okay, I have to push back on one of the phrases used to describe this because I initially found it really jarring.
Oh, which one?
This demand for exemption from accountability because of past harm, the text describes it as a perpetual temper tantrum.
Ah, yes.
And honestly, I tripped over that. Calling an empire-building tyrant, or even just a highly manipulative, destructive boss or partner in your life, a child having a tantrum, almost sounds too dismissive.
I can see that.
Right. Doesn't that minimize the real severe threat they pose? Like, if someone is destroying lives, calling it a tantrum feels like we aren't taking them seriously.
I completely understand why that feels dismissive at first glance. But if we dig into the psychology of what a tantrum actually is, the term isn't meant to minimize the threat. It is meant to surgically expose the mechanism behind it.
Okay, expose the mechanism. Walk me through that.
Think about what is happening when a toddler has a tantrum. They are experiencing a massive surge of internal chaos, fear, frustration, exhaustion, and they have absolutely zero capacity to self-soothe or regulate that emotion.
They're just overwhelmed.
Right. So what do? They externalize it. They scream, they thrash, they demand that the external world bend to their will to make the internal chaos stop. The villain is doing the exact same thing, but they're doing it as an adult with power.
Oh, okay. So it's not childish in the sense of being harmless. It's childish in the sense of being entirely dysregulated.
Yes, it is spiritually and psychologically immature. The villain remains completely organized around their trauma. Their inner child is still screaming in pain, unable to self-soothe. And this is the crucial difference that addresses your concern about the threat, instead of doing the hard, quiet, painful work of healing that inner child.
They give that screaming child a throne.
Exactly. They hand the toddler a sword, an army, a corporate doctrine, or a political movement.
Ah, I see. So it's the scale of the tantrum that makes it lethal.
Precisely. A child's tantrum collapses on the grocery store floor. A villain's tantrum builds an empire, starts a war, corrupts an institution, imprisons their partner, or burns the village.
Wow.
The danger comes precisely from the scale. It wields real-world devastation because that emotionally immature, dysregulated core has been handed massive amounts of leverage.
The tantrum becomes an ideology.
Yes, the unhealed trauma becomes the law of the land. The personal grievance becomes a holy mission.
The villain is the wounded self enthroned. Man, that is haunting.
It really is.
You're taking the most broken, terrified part of yourself and putting it in charge of your life. And what's even more tragic about this path is the inherent paradox built into it. We tend to assume the villain is just happily being evil, right? Like
Sure.
they're twirling their mustache, reveling in the dark side.
But the psychological reality is much sadder.
It is. They're desperately seeking relief.
Hmm.
The farther they go down the path of domination, the more they genuinely believe they are moving toward safety, justice, or vindication. But every single step they take actually moves them further away from what they truly need.
It is a devastating psychological trap, often referred to as the cruel inversion. The tragedy of the villain is that their strategy for survival makes their survival impossible.
The cruel inversion.
Yeah. They desperately want healing, but they choose control, which isolates them. They want peace, but they choose domination, which requires constant vigilance.
Right. You can't rest if you're dominating everyone.
Exactly. They want love, but they choose possession, which destroys intimacy. They want to be recognized and valued, but they choose to instill fear, which breeds resentment. They want ultimate freedom from pain, but they become completely and utterly enslaved to their own trauma.
Every solution they apply just creates another thicker layer of bondage. Taking revenge doesn't actually heal the original wound. Acquiring power doesn't comfort the screaming inner child.
Not at all.
Having people fear or worship them doesn't make them feel genuinely loved. Control doesn't make them safe. It just makes the wound more heavily defended. And because of that massive defense system, true healing becomes mechanically impossible.
And why is it impossible? Because healing requires vulnerability. To
Yeah.
heal, you have to expose the wound. You have to practice accountability, remorse, grief, surrender. And most terrifyingly, you must possess the willingness to be changed. But to a villain, to someone who has armored themselves entirely in power and control specifically to avoid vulnerability, every single one of those necessary ingredients for healing looks like a lethal threat.
They literally cannot distinguish between a surgeon's scalpel and an assassin's dagger.
That's a great way to put it.
They mistake softening for weakness. They mistake repentance for public humiliation. They mistake unconditional love for dangerous dependency. They mistake valid correction for a malicious attack.
Yes.
So the door to healing might technically still be open to them, but they have built so much armor around themselves that they physically cannot fit through the frame. And that leads to the ultimate fate of the villain path, which is profound, suffocating loneliness. They don't become lonely because no one ever loved them. They become lonely because love literally cannot penetrate the armor to reach the part of them they keep hidden and enthroned.
The summation of this tragedy is that the villain is chasing happiness with absolute terrifying intensity, but they're using methods that make happiness mechanically impossible. The hero suffers, and through processing that suffering, becomes more capable of love. The villain suffers, and through avoiding the processing, becomes less reachable by love. The hero is forged toward wholeness. The villain is fortified against it.
So if the villain fails this massive psychological test by building all this armor and fortifying themselves against reality, then the hero must have to do the exact opposite.
Right.
If armor leads to the shadow enthroned, then to actually achieve individuation, the hero has to drop the armor. They have to let themselves be completely exposed to the elements. Specifically, they have to be exposed to the fire.
The fire is one of the oldest, most universal mythological and psychological metaphors for intense suffering, testing, and transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And it is crucial to understand that the fire touches both the hero and the villain. Both of them enter the crucible.
Right. Nobody escapes the fire.
Nobody escapes it. Both are tested. Both suffer profound loss. Both are humiliated by the harshness of reality. Both are pushed to the absolute edge of what they thought they were capable of enduring. The difference is not whether they experience the fire. The difference is entirely about what they allow the fire to do to them.
Let's talk about what the fire actually does.
Yes.
Because the central thesis here is that the hero burns and allows something false to die, while the villain burns and clings harder to the false self.
Yes.
This brings up another major psychological term for the material. Ego death. Can we break that down? Because, ego death sounds like something you experience on a spiritual retreat, but what does it actually mean in the context of surviving trauma?
Ego death is a dramatic term, but it describes a very practical psychological necessity.
Okay.
Your ego is essentially your constructed identity. It's the story you tell yourself about who you are, what you deserve, and how the world works. Right. When you experience profound trauma or failure, that story is often shattered. Ego death is the painful, terrifying process of accepting that your old story is no longer viable. It is the collapse of the false self.
And the hero accepts this.
The hero consents to this death. They allow the fire of reality to burn away their illusions, their pride, and their naive assumptions. They allow the fire to act as a sacrament of transformation.
But the villain refuses the ego death.
Completely.
They want the power and the intensity of the fire, but they absolutely refuse the surrender of the ashes. They want vengeance, they want the destruction of their enemies, but they refuse to let their own false identity die.
Exactly. The villain burns, but refuses to resurrect. And the reason they cannot resurrect is because resurrection requires surrender.
Yeah, you have to actually die first.
You have to allow the old thing to die completely before the new thing can be born. The villain might come out of the fire more powerful, more ruthless, and more terrifying, but they do not come out more whole. Their power feels distorted, heavy, and toxic because it isn't resurrection. It is merely combustion. It is a soul using the fire purely as fuel to feed their rage while entirely refusing it as a sacrament of change.
I want to try an analogy here to really cement this difference between combustion and transmutation, because I think it's the most vital distinction in the whole process.
I'd love to hear it.
Let's think about the physics of making glass versus the physics of making charcoal.
Okay, glass versus charcoal. I'm with you.
When you make glass, you take sand, which is raw, opaque, gritty material.
Right.
You subject it to intense, sustained heat. The heat completely melts the sand down. The old form is entirely destroyed. But in that absolute destruction, the substance changes at a molecular level.
The silica bonds break and reform.
Exactly. It becomes clear. It becomes transparent. It becomes capable of letting light pass through it. That is the hero. The hero allows the heat of their trauma to completely melt down their ego, their false self, until they become clear and transparent.
That is transmutation. The substance itself has evolved. And the charcoal.
Right. So making charcoal is a completely different intent with a completely different result. You take a piece of raw wood and you put it in a kiln. But the key is that you restrict the oxygen. You lock it away and you just bake it in the heat. The wood doesn't melt. It doesn't transform into a new transparent state. It just bakes in the dark until all the moisture, all the sap, all the life is driven out of it.
Pyrolysis.
Right. It undergoes pyrolysis. It becomes charred, hardened, opaque, and incredibly brittle. And what is the sole singular purpose of a piece of charcoal?
To burn.
Its only purpose is to be fuel for a destructive fire later on. It is engineered to burn others. That is the villain. They bake in the heat of their trauma, they restrict the oxygen of vulnerability, and they become hardened, entirely made of fuel, just waiting to burn the world down.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the distinction between the forge and the blaze.
The forge and the blaze, yeah.
A blaze, like the fire that consumes the charcoal, consumes indiscriminately. It just turns everything to ash. But a forge has a specific purpose.
Right, you make something in a forge.
Exactly. The hero enters the heat and allows themselves to be hammered by trial, by correction, by grief, by love, by discipline, and by choice. The hammering draws out their hidden strength. Their old shape cannot remain, but their core substance isn't destroyed, it is refined.
But the villain rejects the hammer. They enter the fire, they feel the heat, but they refuse the shaping. They might become harder, sharper, and much more dangerous, exactly like that brittle piece of charcoal, but they do not become truer to themselves. So the hero's fire is initiatory. It starts something new. The villain's fire is purely retaliatory.
Which brings us to one of the most powerful psychological pivots we can make when facing trauma. It perfectly crystallizes the difference in mindset.
Let's hear it.
The hero looks at their pain and says, "This trauma must change me."
Let's change me.
The villain looks at the exact same pain and says, "This trauma gives me the right to change everyone else."
Wow. I want everyone listening to just sit with that for a second. Think about what it actually requires to say, this trauma must change me.
It requires a terrifying amount of vulnerability.
Yes. It means standing in the wreckage of your life and admitting that your current coping mechanisms, your current worldview, maybe even your current identity, are totally insufficient for the reality you're now facing. You have to willingly let the old you burn away. It is exhausting, painful work.
It is.
But saying, this trauma gives me the right to change everyone else, that requires zero vulnerability.
None.
It's the ultimate shortcut. It's pure psychological projection. You take all the agony and chaos you're feeling inside, and you use it as a weapon to force the external world to accommodate your unhealed wound.
And that shortcut is why a hero rises from the ashes while a villain weaponizes the ashes. The hero lets the fire form them. The villain lets the fire justify them.
So, if the fire is the external test, the crucible of reality, what happens when the hero survives that heat and finally looks in the mirror? Because if the hero actually allowed themselves to be melted down or reformed, they're going to see things much more clearly.
They are.
And this brings us to what I think is the most uncomfortable, unsettling truth in this entire deep dive. We desperately like to think there is a vast, unbridgeable canyon between the good guys and the bad guys. But the psychology forces us to confront the terrifying fact that the hero and the villain are essentially made of the exact same material.
This is known as the mirror test.
The mirror test.
And it represents the deepest, most treacherous part of the internal work of individuation. Facing a villain externally is difficult, but the deeper, much harder work is entirely internal.
Right.
The hero has to look inward and confront the very real, very potent part of themselves that could have become the villain under the exact same pressure.
I love how this dynamic plays out in dialogue. In almost every great story, there is a moment where the villain looks at the hero and tries to tempt them by saying, "You and I are the same."
Classic trope.
Yes. And the natural knee-jerk reaction for the hero and for any of us when we're compared to someone toxic or destructive is to immediately recoil and say, no, we are completely different. We have absolutely nothing in common.
But the psychology says that denial is a lie.
It is a lie. The hero's true, deeper, fully integrated answer shouldn't be denial. It should be, yes, we are made of the exact same material, but I choose differently.
That choice is everything. The hero acknowledges their own shadow. They have opened that invisible bag we talked about earlier.
They've looked inside.
They look inside and acknowledge that they, too, possess the capacity for profound rage, for manipulation, for control, for taking that easy, seductive shortcut to power. They know they have the charcoal inside them, but they actively, daily choose limits. They choose restraint.
This leads into a concept that really challenged my own thinking. It's the danger of goodness. There's a psychological trap where the hero's greatest danger is actually believing they're incapable of becoming the villain.
Yeah.
The premise is this. The moment someone says, I am the good one, therefore whatever I do is justified, they are already standing on the villain's threshold.
It's a slippery slope.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, identifying as an inherently good person is actually a massive red flag.
Yeah, it can be.
How does someone maintain their moral compass and do the right thing if they aren't even allowed to call themselves the good guy?
It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? But it resolves beautifully when you differentiate between goodness as a static possession and goodness as a daily practice.
Okay, break that down.
The mature, integrated hero does not identify with goodness as a possession, like a badge they can pin to their chest and never think about again. Because think about the logic. If you believe you are inherently good at your core, then by definition, any action you take must be a good action.
Oh, wow.
That logic entirely bypasses all accountability. You no longer have to evaluate your behavior or question your motives because your identity as the good guy provides a blanket retroactive justification for anything you do.
I never thought about it like that. That is exactly how the villain operates. The villain does terrible things because they believe their ultimate goal is so righteous that the methods don't matter.
Precisely. That is moral licensing at its absolute worst.
Moral licensing.
That is why the mature hero must submit to ongoing correction. Mercy, accountability, self-examination, and community feedback matter so much because they are the only mechanisms that keep the hero from becoming the very monster they rose up to defeat.
They have to stay grounded.
The hero accepts constant formation. The villain refuses all correction. The hero serves the kingdom. The villain tries to possess it.
Let's pull this right down into everyday life, because I think this is where this insight becomes incredibly practical and diagnostic.
Okay.
Think about any major argument on the internet, or the highly polarized nature of modern politics. And to be clear, we are looking at this purely through a psychological lens. We aren't taking any sides here.
Right, just observing the behavior.
Exactly. Look at the architecture of those conflicts. Look at the behavior on any side of any fierce debate. The exact, precise moment a group or an individual decides that they are the absolute, unquestionable good ones. The moment they declare a monopoly on righteousness, they immediately grant themselves psychological permission to use villainous tactics.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
They start dehumanizing their opponents. They justify lying. They manipulate. They dox people. They try to burn the other side's life down. And why?
Yeah.
How do they sleep at night? Because they genuinely believe their inherent goodness justifies their cruelty.
It is the ultimate trap of self-righteousness. When you are fighting a monster, you have to be excruciatingly careful not to pick up the monster's weapons, or you simply become a new monster.
Right.
Individuation demands that we never, ever stop questioning our own shadows. The moment you stop examining your own capacity for evil, you become highly susceptible to committing it. The hero lets love become a rigorous law within them. The villain takes their trauma and makes it a rigid law over others.
Okay, so let's map out where we are.
Sure.
The hero acknowledges their shadow. They survive the fire of reality without letting it turn them into brittle charcoal. They submit to ongoing accountability and resist the seductive temptation to just declare themselves permanently good. They fight the battle, they maintain their humanity, and they win.
A successful journey.
But what happens after the battle is won. If a hero spends 10 years, or a lifetime, defining themselves entirely by their fight against this villainous force, they don't just turn off warrior mode on a random Tuesday.
No, they don't.
Doesn't their entire identity risk collapsing when the villain is finally gone?
That is the ultimate test, and it marks the final transition in the process of individuation, the transition from the warrior to the sovereign.
From the warrior to the sovereign.
Okay.
Early on in the journey, the villain actually serves a psychological purpose for the hero. The villain helps define the hero by contrast. The hero discovers their courage only because something terrifying threatens what they love.
That makes sense.
The villain provides the necessary resistance for the hero to build their moral muscles.
Right. Without Goliath, David is just a shepherd kid throwing rocks. The massive obstacle forces the hero to emerge. But if the hero remains entirely dependent on that opposition forever, they aren't fully free, are they? Their identity is still organized around the battle. They're essentially still reacting. And there is a very real biological component to this. When we talk about prolonged trauma or prolonged conflict, we have to talk about the sympathetic nervous system.
The fight-or-flight response.
Exactly. The nervous system gets accustomed to danger. It gets stuck in fight or flight. Hypervigilance becomes the body's baseline state. So when peace finally arrives, it doesn't feel like relief.
It feels weird.
It feels strange. It feels boring, suspicious, or even entirely unsafe. The brain is scanning the horizon saying, where is the threat? I only know how to function when there is a threat.
Wow.
Because of this, a hero who hasn't fully integrated might unconsciously seek out another battle or even invent a new enemy simply because the adrenaline and clarity of battle is the only way they know how to feel alive.
Yeah, I think we all know people like that. It is so exhausting to live in constant warrior mode, always scanning the horizon, always defining yourself strictly by what you are against.
It's no way to live.
No. The defining shift of the fully realized self is moving from the warrior hero, whose primary question is, what must I defeat, to the sovereign hero, whose primary question is, what must I cultivate?
That shift from destruction to creation is the hallmark of the integrated self.
Cultivating instead of defeating.
Yes. A mature sovereign hero does not need an enemy to have a purpose. They don't need a perpetual crisis to feel meaningful. They move from fighting to creating. They transition their energy into acts of living devotion. stewardship, creating beauty, establishing justice, teaching, building, healing, tending to the vulnerable, protecting, and blessing.
There is a very specific, almost paradoxical part of this final stage that I really had to sit with.
Oh.
It's about how the hero interacts with the villain at the very end of the line.
Yeah.
We have this romanticized idea in our culture that if you just love someone hard enough, you can fix them.
Oh, right. The savior complex.
Yeah. But the psychology here is brutal and clear. It states that the hero cannot heal the villain by simply loving the villain harder. Why is that? I mean, doesn't love conquer all? If the hero is finally whole, shouldn't their wholeness be able to save the broken villain?
Love is profoundly powerful, but true, mature love also deeply respects sovereignty. The hero can only become a clear, unwavering witness of love.
A witness.
They can stand there and make the path to redemption visible, but the crucial, non-negotiable boundary is this. The hero must never need the villain to heal in order for the hero to be free.
Wait, say that again.
The hero must never need the villain to heal in order to be free themselves. If your freedom, your peace, or your happiness is contingent on someone else finally fixing their trauma, you are still held hostage by them.
Wow. You're still trapped.
You are still completely entangled in their sickness. The villain's healing is entirely 100% their own responsibility. The hero has to let go of the ego-driven need to be the savior.
That is such a hard pill to swallow, especially when the villain is someone you care about.
It's incredibly hard.
You could be a lighthouse, but you can't jump into the freezing water, swim to their sinking boat, and drag it to shore for them. They have to steer their own ship.
That's a beautiful metaphor, yes.
And once the hero truly accepts that once they let go of the need to fight the villain and the need to save the villain, they can access a mythological state referred to in the material as the red heifer or phoenix pattern.
Let's unpack those symbols because they are dense.
Yes, please do. I understand the phoenix, the bird that burns and is reborn from its own ashes. That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
But what on earth is the red heifer pattern?
Yep.
I completely tripped over that. What does a cow have to do with psychological healing?
Well, it's a very ancient, specific, biblical, and mythological symbol of ultimate purification. In ancient traditions, the ashes of a completely unblemished red heifer, a pure sacrifice, were mixed with fresh, flowing spring water.
Okay.
This mixture was the only thing that could ceremonially cleanse someone who had been defiled by coming into contact with death.
Ashes and water.
Exactly. Psychologically, it represents the paradox of healing. The very ashes of the fire that destroyed your old self, when mixed with the purity of new life, become the exact medicine required to cure your deepest defilement.
Oh.
The hero's ashes are not the end of their story. They are the active ingredient in their power to purify themselves and their environment from the touch of death and trauma.
And the fresh flowing spring water in that ritual, the material refers to this as living water, which it defines as emotions that are not stagnant in the body.
Right.
When the refined trauma, the ashes of the ego death, is finally met with flowing, fully processed emotions, the grief, the tears, the acceptance it transforms. The text says death's defilement can be cleansed into compost.
That is the alchemy of individuation right there.
Compost. I love that imagery so much. It brings the entire journey back down to earth.
It really does.
Trauma isn't just something you awkwardly survive, sweep under the rug, and try to forget. When it is fully processed, when the ashes meet that living water, it is fundamentally recycled. It becomes the very soil, the rich, dense fertilizer that grows the sovereign's new kingdom.
It gives life.
Yes. The healed hero is finally happy. And I love how happiness is defined here. It's not defined as being completely untouched by sorrow or being free from all conflict forever, which is, a child's fantasy of happiness.
Right. That's not reality.
It is defined as being deeply rooted, intensely loved, highly purposeful, internally whole, and ultimately capable of rest.
They are capable of rest because they finally know what they serve. The villain path, the path of the unintegrated shadow, constantly whispers, without someone to blame, without an enemy to fight, I do not know who I am.
So true.
But the mature, individuated hero says, I know what I serve. The villain is recognized as a necessary part of the initiation, but they are absolutely not the destination. At the end of the deeper myth, the hero is not standing eternally over a defeated enemy with their sword raised in triumph.
They've put the sword away.
Exactly. The hero has put the sword away. They are planting a garden. They are building the city. They are loving the beloved. They are raising children. They are teaching apprentices. They are restoring the temple.
They're opening the gates. They're actually living in the kingdom they once had to fight so bitterly to protect.
Exactly. The hero is forged through the intense heat of conflict, but they are only fulfilled through the daily acts of love. The villain awakens them, but does not complete them. True, cultivated peace completes them.
Man, let's bring all of this together. We have gone on a massive, profound journey of individuation today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We started at a shared starting line, looking at two wounded people standing in the wreckage of a broken, unfair world.
Yeah.
One of them refused the agonizing pain of growth. They demanded absolute control to feel safe. They refused correction, let their unhealed trauma become an authoritarian law over everyone else, and were ultimately baked into brittle, highly combustible charcoal, ending up isolated and alone inside an armored empire of their own making.
A tragic outcome.
And the other person faced the exact same fire. But they allowed it to melt them down. They accepted the terrifying death of their old, fragile ego. They integrated their hidden shadow, realizing they had the exact same capacity for darkness, but actively, daily, choosing limits and responsibility.
Yes.
They submitted to ongoing accountability, and ultimately, they took the ashes of their burned-down life, mixed it with the flowing water of processed grief, and used it to grow a vibrant garden.
For you listening to this, I want you to realize that every single time you face a grievance, a betrayal, a profound disappointment, or a trauma in your own life, you are standing at that exact critical pivot point.
Right.
You are at the crossroads. Your brain is going to want to take the shortcut of control. Will you let the trauma become a rigid law over others, or will you do the agonizing work of letting it purify you?
It is a choice we have to make continually. Like, it isn't a one-time event that you just check off a list.
No.
It is the ongoing daily work of becoming whole. I will leave you with one final thought to mull over, something to take with you into your week after this deep dive is done. If the sovereign hero is ultimately defined by what they cultivate rather than what they defeat, I want you to look around at your own life right now.
Look closely.
Look at where your mental energy goes every single day. Are you currently organizing your life, your thoughts, your arguments, and your passions around an enemy you are desperately trying to defeat? Or are you organizing your life around a garden you're trying to grow? And if your enemy, whatever or whoever that is for you, if your enemy completely vanished from the face of the earth tomorrow, would you still know who you are?